This is Andrea Longton.
This is Leah Freemouth.
And this is Ebony Perkins. And we are Renegade Capital.
All views expressed in this podcast are our own. We are not financial planners, investment advisors, or tax advisors. The views that we have on this show do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of the people who sign our paychecks. So please keep that in mind and always consult a trained financial professional before you start moving your hard-earned money. Let's dive in.
All right, folks. So climate change clearly is real. I know that I am getting so freaking hot outside. Wildfires and storms and all of the floods are increasing and they're becoming a lot more intense. Have you ever thought about how you'll protect yourself and your community so you're prepared for these changes?
I'm behind the curve. I know I am, and I know what I need to do, but I also know that I am really behind the curve and also trying to figure out how do I finance this? And how do I prioritize those expenses across other things that I need to do as well? But not all of it's immediately affordable. For the long run, absolutely. But how do you finance it up front? And how do you rework your financial structuring so that it works for your family? That's what I got to tackle. What about you, Ebony?
Yeah, I think about a few years ago, I had a family member who bought a house, and this was in their dream neighborhood. And I'm yeah, this is great, but my gut is saying this is a flood zone. Is this really where we need to place you all as seniors? So I'm from Columbia, and we had 1,000-year flood, right? But these 1,000-year floods are happening more often. We shouldn't be having a 1,000-year flood every 5 years. And I want to start thinking about, okay, folks, hey, let's not look at this house because I don't want to put you in a bad predicament, especially as some insurance companies, right, are starting to consider whether they are going to cover flood insurance or even insurance from fires, depending on what state you're in, right? I think about that often. I'm even on this board in North Carolina that focuses on conservation. And they have a huge project in a community that is a large community of color, low income group. They are hit by floods all the time just because of where they're placed geographically. And so they are doing projects to try and help build an infrastructure so that these communities don't have to leave, have to choose between leaving their home that they've known for decades versus staying and dying, for lack of a better word. So how can we create an infrastructure so that you are okay? I even think about kids who play outside.
Oh, we've been under a heat advisory all week long, and the kids can't go outside to play at recess.
All week long. Exactly. What can our schools do now in order to, we don't want to have to cancel school because the AC units are going out, which we're seeing here. How can we build a system in order to protect our folks? Okay, can we put in practice or breaks during practice so that somebody won't stroke out on the football field? I'm just always thinking about that type of stuff. What about you, Leah?
My head bounced around a couple different ways where, growing up in West Virginia, we always had 4 seasons and we would sled and snow. And again, 4 seasons, right? We had no snow in Virginia, or at least where I live in Virginia, in Richmond last year. Not one day. And and that's scary for all the things that the earth is changing. And went to Iceland in June and saw the glacier, and the guide that was sharing with us where the glacier started. Well, obviously it's way bigger than it is in 2023. But even 2 or 3 years ago, you could see the path of it receding back, and where we were standing and people were hiking on it and stuff, you could just hear it dripping because it's just melting. And it's this is not going to be here if Hazen comes back as an adult.
I am becoming more and more passionate about environmental justice every day. And one of the things that really stands out to me with the work in the environment, a lot of times we can put it on the back burner, because I know I did and still sometimes do without knowing. Like, okay, I'll worry about that when it becomes an emergency, right? But in reality, there are people who are facing the effects of climate change like today. There are some people who haven't experienced it today and they will experience it tomorrow or next week or next year, whatever it may be, right? And the unfortunate thing is, a lot of the people that are experiencing these effects, they are the folks who may not have the means or the resources to shield them from it. And so I'm super excited about our guests today with Invest Appalachia, who are really thinking about this environmental fight from a different angle, which is climate resilience. And really, how do we build and support our communities and plan for the change that is going to come, right? This change that's going to come, how do we plan to support these communities in the meantime? Because it's not just going to happen overnight. We have to come up with a plan, and then we can find out how to invest in and support that.
This is Andrea Longton.
This is Leah Freeman.
This is Ebony Perkins, and we are Renegade Capital. Today, we're talking about how you can use your investments to create a climate-resistant world. Join us.
Renegade Capital Podcast is proud to be sponsored by U.S. Bancorp Impact Finance, a subsidiary of U.S. Bank, which is an industry leader in providing financial solutions that help create positive impact for communities and the environment. For 35 years, its tax credit investments and syndications, lending, and other financial solutions have helped create affordable housing, spur economic activity in underserved communities, restore historic buildings, develop renewable sources of energy, and strengthen community development financial institutions, or CDFIs, nationwide. Learn more at usbank.com/impactfinance.
Today, we are joined by our friends at Invest Appalachia, an impact investment platform that aims to increase investment into communities that have been historically underserved. They work across the Appalachian communities of Kentucky, West Virginia, Ohio, North Carolina, and Tennessee. They are committed to a strategy that takes the best of impact investing and make it work for Appalachia, putting community interest and impact first. They are committed to accelerating and supporting key sectors, including climate resistance and environmental sustainability, which we're actually talking about today. Andrew Crosson is Invest Appalachia's founding CEO, and he is responsible for overall strategy and impact. Andrew brings more than a decade of experience advancing community economic development in Appalachia, leading major initiatives related to local food systems development, clean energy, and among other areas of expertise. He was born and raised on a family farm in the mountains of western North Carolina, part of the community he still serves to this day. Baylen Campbell is Invest Appalachia's Director of Community Impact. Originally from and based in Hazard, Kentucky, Baylen brings experience working as an economic development and social impact practitioner. In partnership with the Community Advisory Council, Baylen leads Invest Appalachia's catalytic capital development, deployment, and community accountability. Thank you guys for joining us. I am psyched about this conversation. So, by way of introduction, please tell us a little bit about yourselves and describe your vision of a clean, climate resilient community. What does that look like?
Well, thanks so much for having us, Ebony. So this is Andrew, and Baylen and I are going to be tag teaming these discussions with you all. I'll start with the organizational level. So you noted our geography, which is the Central Appalachian region, and I would say as an organization, Invest Appalachia is seeking a region and trying to support a region where every community is inclusive, equitable, prosperous, and resilient. And when we look at all of those factors, including that last word, it's becoming more and more clear through science and just through the real world events around us that climate resilience is going to be a really highly relevant factor in the ability of people in Appalachia and elsewhere, for that matter, to survive and thrive in the place that they choose to live. So it's just not something that we can ignore when we think about the future of our communities. On a personal level, I grew up as a poor farm kid in rural Western North Carolina. So I paid a lot of attention to the importance of community, to the dynamics of the economy, and then to the environment around me. So those intersections have always been sort of a focal point and driving force for me in this work. So this topic is near and dear to my heart personally.
Thank you all for having us. Great to be with you. I'm Baylen Campbell. I'm I's Director of Community Impact, and I'm born and raised in Hazard, Kentucky, a small town in the coal fields. Academically, I come to this work with a background in international and sustainable development. And I would say like Invest Appalachia's climate analysis, which I'm sure we'll talk about, and a number of initiatives that I'm a part of have emerged after back-to-back years of severe flooding here in eastern Kentucky, where I've been involved in emergency response, coordination, fundraising, and supporting long-term recovery efforts in my capacity with IA. During non-flood times, I've been involved in a lot of downtown revitalization, advocacy, and policy efforts in the region. To me, a climate resilient community is one where communities are equipped with the knowledge and training to be their best agents of preparedness and recovery after a climate shock, and able to be proactive in adapting their built-in natural environments.
So, a lot of the work that you're doing with Invest Appalachia is really supporting rural communities. And yet, climate resilience is a key focus area of you. The reality is, like, just in regular mainstream conversations, we don't often associate environmental issues with rural communities. Why in the world, if that's not the case, why did you choose to make that an overarching theme for your portfolio of investments?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ebony. Well, one of the themes I think of our work, of Baylen and I's work, and of this report is just debunking, I think, some of the urban-centric analysis of environmental sustainability and climate resilience, and illustrating really the interconnections, right? That rural communities and urban communities have a great deal of exchange that's only going to become more and more important to consider in the balance of things as climate change begins to impact every aspect of our lives. So, as I mentioned earlier, our goal is a region where every community has the resources they need to thrive. That means across sectors and across generations, and climate is going to become more and more of a factor. Our report analysis showed that climate change is going to affect every area of our economy. So every aspect, therefore, of community development, of investment, of philanthropy. We just had a conversation earlier today with members of the Appalachia Funders Network. These are all types of grant makers doing all types of work across the region. And I said very loud and clear to them, it doesn't matter what you fund, climate is going to impact your work. It's going to impact the issues you care about. It's going to impact the communities you care about. So we don't see it as optional to include in our analysis. So it really does transcend sectors, other issue areas, and cuts across our entire portfolio. We think it takes a whole system approach to think about climate resilience. So it's not just clean energy. It's not just green tech. A lot of times in these conversations, people use climate as shorthand for those things. Those are specific mitigation and adaptation efforts that are important, but they don't change the reality for people on the ground, right? People on the ground need the basic amenities. They need the infrastructure. They need industries and business sectors that are going to be crucial to people being able to actually exist and be able to thrive in place in a climate impacted future.
Can you give us an example of what infrastructure would look like on that basic human level?
Yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily the really sexy stuff that people imagine, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when we think about climate and clean energy, people are imagining wind farms, solar farms, EV, electric vehicles, all this sort of stuff. That's a piece of the puzzle. But we also have to think about what people are already struggling with, right? Housing, right? There's limited housing stock in the region. There's limits on buildable land. There is pressure from expanding flood zones. There's going to be pressure from in-migration. So things like housing, things like community facilities, downtown revitalization, food systems, right? Having food systems be more resistant to supply chain shocks. Things like that are so common and mundane and everyday that you might not think of them as part of the climate resilience solution.
Just for our listeners' benefit, when you're mentioning a report, can you explain what report that is?
Earlier this year, Invest Appalachia launched a regional climate analysis, which looks at the long-term predictive impacts of the climate crisis using predictive climate models to better understand what the longitudinal impacts of climate will be in the region. how that interfaces with ongoing community and economic development work, policy, and investment. Our goal is to make the region's case, because all too often we have to make it for ourselves in terms of demystifying place in many regards. Oftentimes, when you look at the listicles online and popular literature, as well as academic lit, you'll find that most quote unquote climate havens in the US are cities in the Midwest. But Central Appalachia stands to be well placed for climate migration. We won't be without challenges. We will continue to be impacted by severe flooding, increased rates of forest fires. It'll be hotter, but overwhelmingly, the data is consistent that we will be habitable, agriculturally viable, fairly temperate, and by and large, well placed for other folks to call the mountains home.
So is that what a climate haven is somewhere that is comfortable to live in, given our climate crisis?
When we're looking at long-term impact, yes. The UN predicts that climate will be the leading driver of migration globally over the course of the century. And we need to be thinking critically, especially at a time where incredible amounts of federal resources are flowing, about how we can prepare our communities to welcome newcomers and have that capacity to do so.
With the Appalachia region being a climate haven, let's say we don't act, let's say we don't plan. What will happen? Are you worried about anything? Or should we just be like, we're good? You got so much land down there.
Yeah, so Appalachia is a big region. We are focused more on Central Appalachia. And, the report that Baylen was describing found that Central Appalachia uniquely, so Eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, Western North Carolina, it's interesting. It kind of overlays almost perfectly to coal country, right? So the region that produced coal that, obviously is contributing to climate change because of the very mountains that produce the coal is also what is now being described as a climate haven. Basically, it's going to mitigate some of the worst effects of climate change because of our elevation, because of our forests, because of our temperate climate, because of the abundance of water. So when people talk about climate havens in the literature, as Baylen pointed out, it tends to be very urban centric, right? It's mostly about cities. It's still an urbanization frame, both domestically and internationally, right? It's about migration to cities and how our cities going to prepare for migration that's driven by climate change. But our point is that climate havens can also be rural places that are well positioned to absorb population, right? And Central Appalachia is certainly in that category. But going back to your original question, Ebony, what happens if we don't act, right? If we don't act, as Baylen said, people are going to be moving one way or the other. The first people to move are going to be the people that can afford it, right? The last people to move are going to be people that can't afford it and that are already living in marginal or vulnerable situations. So the cost of not acting is that existing socioeconomic inequalities, not just in Appalachia, but everywhere, are going to be exacerbated to an extreme degree. So in Appalachia, for example, we look at things that are going to be driving rural gentrification, right? Migration without planning is going to result in land grabs, housing speculation, worsening housing crisis that already exists in rural communities that isn't talked about very much, more flooding deaths and other deaths from natural disasters, overburdened social services, continued resource extraction, continued greenhouse gas emissions, food system fragility, public health crises, and then, big picture, severe social fragmentation and geopolitical conflict, right? If we're not planning for population shifts of this magnitude, then we're inviting some of the worst tendencies in our economy and in our society to take over. We can blunt those negative effects by being proactive, but we really do have to start now.
Oh, that's a mess. Oh, that's a hot, funky mess.
That's most definitely.
It's a side question. I hope it's related, but as a West Virginia native who left about 20 years ago, I grew up in Morgantown. So my West Virginia experience is different than my friends from Grafton and different parts of the state. All that to say is now that I'm in the work that I'm in with community development and investment, and I look back to, at the time, Senator Byrd was very famous for bringing the pork home, and pork looked like coal and natural gas and the FBI, and there's no diversity in West Virginia's economy. And so therefore all the problems and things that it's as a state needs to solve for now. And as I've seen my friends where their families were working in the coal mines, or now they've shifted over to the natural gas industry and have high paying jobs there. And, again, well-paying jobs, they don't have to leave. Like, is that the dynamic you're talking about, Andrew, with like the bigger bad actors that will come in and fill the space? It's just more of that is going to happen, or?
I'll be curious to hear what Baylen has to say with this. She's born and raised in the coal fields of Eastern Kentucky, right? But I think there's bad actors in the sense that exploitative and extractive economic practices are going to continue, right? There's well-documented literature that basically shows, economically speaking, Central Appalachia has served as a resource colony for the United States, right? For industrial development of this country. There's been a lack of, investment, especially community investment, a lack of economic opportunity and diversification, these mono economies. That's all been on purpose, right? That's not been an accident. It's been a way to extract and monetize value from the region. But as those industries fade, coal is fading on its own, it has very little to do with regulations. Natural gas is not providing the economic boom and lasting jobs that it was supposed to. Our friends at the Ohio River Valley Institute just released a paper analyzing the economic impacts of the natural gas industry, or Frackalacha, as they called it. But then there's just these more benign or not malicious effects, right? Like people moving because they want to live in a nicer place, right? I can't tell you how many people have moved to my home region of Western North Carolina because it's beautiful, right? They want to be near a cool city like Asheville. They love the small towns. They love the outdoors. They love the mountains. But they're not recognizing the effects that they're having on local communities, displacing workers, increasing the cost of living, taking up the limited housing supply. The list goes on and on. So there's the bad actors, there's those trends, but there's also just the preparedness of communities and regions to absorb people who don't have any malice. They're just looking for a place that they can live in peace and harmony.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, Central Appalachia is a region that has been intrinsically shaped by extraction, extractive investment practices, extractive industries, and outmigration. But when I look at this data and this research and the ongoing impact of climate in the region, what we're seeing, especially in Eastern Kentucky, we're seeing outmigration currently. But the unique nature and sort of geostrategic location of Appalachia is one where we are well poised for sizable in-migration and investment over time. So when I look at it, it's a pretty dark and almost poetic scenario where there's the likelihood for some form of reincarnation of the broad form deed through a climate lens, where folks with means, with resources are coming in, but folks who have been here, want to stay here, might not be able to.
We had another show in season 1 talking about, there was an industry that really exploited a marginalized community, and now all of a sudden it has the regulations where you can have businesses in that industry, and now the very people who were marginalized because of that industry aren't able to take advantage of the economic advantages from that industry, and it feels very similar. People who are living there, who desperately want to stay there, but have fewer and fewer means to be able to stay where they want to be and have to leave. And then people who may, and this is totally hypothetical, but people who are able to afford to choose the climate haven in which they want to live and build up their own infrastructure and their own broadband systems to be able to work remotely, are able to go in and purchase that land whenever it's favorable. And it rings similar to me of, oof, that doesn't sit well. And what does that investment look like before people have to move out, and to get that investment and infrastructure in before that happens so that people can stay? Because Eastern Kentucky doesn't really have like an Asheville, where they have this really attractive, cool city that you can gravitate towards. Like Hazard is the big city in Eastern Kentucky in many ways. Maybe
give us a few years.
Yeah, okay. I was there a couple years ago. I'm like, man, this is coming up. Like, this is going to be a whole thing. Yeah. So how do you get that investment in before it becomes that, oh, that's bad? Because it feels like it's hard to raise that capital until it's already post-crisis.
Yeah, I mean, that's really well said, Andrea. And that is like why we exist, right? Is to try to get capital as an impact investment platform, to get capital to businesses and community projects that are not receiving it otherwise, right? Where there is, I just really want to emphasize, like, people might have, like, it's very true that there's been a lot of economic marginalization and suppression of activity and inequality across racial and gender and geographical lines. But that isn't to say that nothing's happening in the region, right? Like, people have been self-organizing here for a long time. Appalachia is, the cradle of the U.S. labor movement, right? Of unionization, of workers organizing, and likewise, like, there's been a lot of really innovative community economic development work done here, especially over the past few decades. Really well networked groups. So there's a lot of strategies and like business models, sector development models out there that are ready for investment. They're crying out for investment, but they need investment that understands the historical context, right? That is structured appropriately to absorb real and perceived risk in communities that haven't received investment before, right? So that's what we're set up to do, is to try to empower, communities that are in place, that are rooted in place, to create opportunity for people who are already there before that inevitable influx of both capital and in migration that is unlikely to be in line with community priorities that are existing today.
Renegade Capital Podcast is proud to be sponsored by Self-Help Credit Union and Self-Help Federal Credit Union, which believe in the power of finance to transform lives and communities. Are you an impact investor looking to make a difference? Look no further than Self-Help, where your deposits can create positive change. Don't just invest for profit, invest for impact. Visit selfhelp.org/invest-for-impact today and start depositing into a money market or term certificate with Self-Help Credit Union, where your money can change lives. Self-Help Credit Union, ownership and economic opportunity for all.
Do you have a story that you're especially proud of how you've been able to finance something along those lines?
Yeah, so we have the ability to blend different forms of investment. So to provide a loan, right, similar to what a CDFI might do, alongside philanthropic capital, what we call catalytic capital, which is basically credit enhancements, loan guarantees, loan loss reserves, interest rate buy downs, things like that. And we've been able to do, just in our first year of operation, a few transactions that are really interesting, capital stacks, to use language that some of your listeners might already be familiar with and others might not. So, for example, we've just tried out some really interesting financing mechanisms, like a conditional repayment loan for housing development in the wake of the Eastern Kentucky floods. So we made a large grant that was structured as a conditional repayment loan to multiple affordable housing developers in Eastern Kentucky this time last year, so that they could use the upfront capital to buy lots, begin building houses, and then as they sell those houses, they recycle those proceeds, build more houses, and at the end of the 5-year term, they've got the cash to repay us.
Amazing.
Right? They couldn't do that with a loan because they would have to jump through all these hoops related to, liens and extra paperwork and assigning the deeds and all that. So by using grant capital that is 100% repayable, we were able to create dozens of new housing units that wouldn't have gotten built otherwise.
That's fantastic.
What else can we do to start preparing now for what's about to come?
We wanted to start the conversation, but we don't have all the answers. So just earlier today, we were on with presenting with a colleague who works with NOAA, right? Works with data and science related to climate, and recognizing just how much information there is out there that we're really scraping the surface of. Even the analysis in our report looks at several measures of climate impact and several measures of migration, but there aren't regionally specific climate assessments, right? So we need a better handle on the specific risks, right? The level of granularity to say, where should we site this new housing development or this new building? Because the floodplains are changing. That data is not super relevant anymore. So we need better data. We need better information. We need more investment We've sort of advocated for both federal investment. There's a precedent for in the form of a coastal preservation fund, which is federally funded but nonprofit managed to subsidize and incentivize investment into coastal preservation, wetlands preservation. Why couldn't we do something like that in Appalachia, right? And same thing for private philanthropy. Grant dollars go a lot longer. They go a lot longer away if you're using them to incentivize or leverage repayable investment. So I think that's an opportunity here in the Appalachian region as well.
We're also in the process of working with our partners at the North Carolina Institute of Climate Sciences, which is a NOAA affiliate, the High Tech Foundation out of West Virginia, and academic institutions to create what we're calling the Appalachian Climate, Knowledge, and Resilience Nexus, or ACORN, because that's a real mouthful. And what the aim of this is to thread the needle between climate sciences, democratizing that data to inform community and economic development efforts, philanthropy, workforce development, and curriculum with academic institutions to ensure that we're providing the necessary resources and information in accessible manners to all parties involved to really move the needle at the community level.
So Invest Appalachia, I mean, since the beginning, innovative, flexible, kind of focused on place and the people. As it evolves and the work evolves, are things like wealth building through investment, like non-accredited investors being able to participate in local investments from that standpoint? Have you started to kind of kick the tires on ideas like that, where you're generating wealth through investment, but at a hyper local, maybe lower level than maybe our philanthropies or corporate funders can do, or even our individual investors there at the accredited level?
Yeah, it's a good question, Leah. We started out, as you know, our model is meant to attract institutional capital, right? And so that's what we're managing and deploying. But I couldn't tell you how many inquiries I've gotten just through our website from random people who say, hey, I'm from Appalachia, or I love Appalachia. How can I invest? Right? Just individuals. And I have to say, unfortunately, we're not set up for retail investment at this point, right? There's no way to buy in, buy a note or whatever in our Invest Appalachia's platform. So I think there's a need there. There's a hunger. People want to invest into their own communities. Our starting premise has been that our region is resource constrained, right? We've never had our fair share of resources. So we're trying to attract new investment from the outside. But by using our capital in the most catalytic way that we can, we're also hoping to leverage more investment from within the region. So we have entrepreneurs and landowners and business owners who are willing to put skin in the game if they had someone in there alongside with them. And I think there's an opportunity to build out more of a retail investment platform like what you were describing as well.
I want to go back to something that Baylen said about ACORN and engaging with communities. How has Invest Appalachia, specifically its climate initiatives, been received by the local communities?
Great question. I think that the answer to that is evolving, but overwhelmingly positive. And I would say that ranges from really great ongoing conversations within regional philanthropy to positive individual conversations I've had with county judge executives when I'm asking, okay, great, you all are building that road back and that ditch back. Wonderful. At what capacity, though? Because if it didn't survive the last flood, how can we anticipate it to survive the next?
Mm-hmm.
What we're doing with the analysis, what we're attempting to do with ACORN and with other initiatives is to continue building on that conversation, building a level of confidence at the local level about what this data tells us, and in time establishing new norms for how we're working, for how we're moving money, and how we're perceiving place as a whole.
Yeah, and the community angle is an interesting one, right? So like, how do you speak to residents in a way that is empowering, right? That's not just scaring them. That's not, talking down to them, things like that. Climate change, when psychologists study climate change and say, like, for a problem this existential, how has it gotten this far without action, right? So there's this thing called a collective action problem. But then they also look at just the scale of it, right? That it is actually breaks our brains to try to understand a problem this big. And that is why people are paralyzed. And that is why people don't mobilize or act on an individual level. And someone made a comment recently that, this is a global issue and we have to turn it into a backyard issue, right? We have to make people care about it and be able to understand it and apply the meaning to their own lives in their own context. So like the example Baylen just described, you talked about the impacts of flooding and the need to design infrastructure, housing, real estate, et cetera, to better withstand future floods. If you talk about how this is the hottest summer that any of us have ever seen, right? And we need more green buildings, more energy efficiency, more cooling, more green spaces in our towns, right? More agriculture that is, sustainable and diversified, that can withstand droughts. Like those are things that people understand because of their lived experience and that make something that's big and scary and conceptual, like climate change, real and actionable. So that's another thing that we're working on doing.
Yeah, we said this earlier before you guys got on here. I just want snow in my, for my kid to be able to sled in the winter. We didn't have 4 seasons this year in Richmond. And I'm one of those people you described. It's the habits that, I'm like, is it easy? And can I afford it? Can I afford it? Maybe. Is it easy? Does it require me to change my behavior? Probably. Am I going to do it? I don't know. You're to your point. I love how you framed it. It's a backyard issue. And yeah, my kid had no snow this winter because of climate change. So being more invested in that experience, even if I can't get the bigger picture in my day to day.
Yeah. And I want to jump back to it as well. It has to be a backyard issue. I mean, and the outward perception of Appalachia is that oftentimes that we don't want to even acknowledge it, but there is a growing widespread acknowledgement that the flooding that we are experiencing regionally is because of the climate crisis. That is a growing grassroots conversation amongst community at large and leaders at the community level. Whether it will be acknowledged outwardly or not, I think is different. But this is a backyard issue, and it's literally taking people's backyards away. And it's increasingly really presenting somewhat of an existential threat for small communities that have historically generally never even experienced flooding. The 22 floods in eastern Kentucky was a crisis along the creeks, not inherently along the rivers within the first 24 to 48 hours. Small creeks that don't really flood, that have never experienced that level of flooding before. And I think that, I've never seen anything like it, and it shook a lot of people. And there's a real desire to start adapting, because folks, you're from Appalachia. It's a part of you. It's your family land, and you don't want to go anywhere. And I hope we don't have to.
I know your work is in Central Appalachia. However, there are a bunch of rural communities across this great nation, and they're also experiencing, the environmental and social impacts of climate change. Can your strategy and your approach be applied to other parts of the country?
So much of the stuff that we do with Invest Appalachia, I end up saying, look, this is Appalachia specific, but it's not Appalachia unique, right? Like we're talking about the place that we know, and that's what we're using to develop our analysis. But I usually think there's a lot of application in other places, and not even just other rural places, to be honest. The parallels between rural and urban areas that have been economically marginalized through economic structures or policies, there's a lot of similarity there, a lot of need for the same types of capital solutions and community organizing solutions. In terms of climate change and climate resilience, one thing that I do think is universal is the whole of system approach, right? Or a whole of community approach. So what we advocate for in this report and in our whole thinking about this is it's not enough to do just one sector. It's not enough to go deal by deal. You have to look at the entire system, the entire community. So whether that's a rural area, an urban area, you've got things like housing, infrastructure, cooling, green space, transportation, food systems that are going to be factors to consider. So identifying what those key sectors are that are going to increase sustainability, what is going to be able to drive opportunity, that's going to be relevant everywhere. And then, unfortunately, everyone needs to take a hard look at those climate projections that Baylen was talking about, right? This is the future that we're going to face. we have to act now. We can prevent the worst of it, but it's happening, right? Places are going to get drier. They're going to get hotter. There's going to be more disasters. And so looking at that data, democratizing that data, as Baylen said, and using it to inform plans, right? Making places more resilient, planning for migration. In some cases, that's going to be planning for out-migration. In some cases, it's going to be planning for in-migration based on that future climate that we're expecting to see. So it's time to start thinking a few decades down the line.
This is like really, really good information. So what actionable items can our audience take to support this work? Can they invest at all?
Yeah, so as I shared with Leah, there's limited investment opportunity from individuals in the systems that we're working in. For institutions, funders, investors, I would say that for individual investors, the first thing that everybody could do is recognize that climate is going to affect their work, right? So every person who works in the space of finance and investment needs to incorporate a climate lens to their work. Doesn't matter if you're an education funder, health funder, housing funder, clean energy funder, whatever. Incorporate a climate resilience lens to your work because it's going to be affecting everything. A second thing is, for national institutions and philanthropies, hopefully we've made the case that Appalachia is going to be relevant to our nation's future, a future impacted by climate resilience. And so paying attention to the Appalachian region, come visit, come get to work, know the work on the ground and support it. And then lastly, we're trying to direct capital, specifically raising grant money for catalytic capital tools like credit enhancements, like loan guarantees, things like that, to use as blended capital with loans and other investments to drive climate resilient investment. So we believe that blended capital approach is going to allow us to go a lot farther, a lot faster in investing in these resilient systems that are going to keep our communities safe and equitable and inclusive.
I love it. Very robust answer. Thank you. So at the end of every episode, we encourage our audience to join the movement, if you will, and become renegades. Something tells me you all know a thing or two about that. So how do you define a renegade?
I think a renegade, because I've just been on this mantra of long-term thinking, right? And so I think to think long-term, that's what makes somebody a renegade. They're thinking outside of their self-interest. They're thinking outside of, what's right in front of them. They're thinking across the system. They're seeing intersections, in like I started with my introduction, between community, between economy, between the environment, and they're thinking about how things are going to play out over time, right? That visionary, that systems thinker, that to me is a renegade.
When I think about a renegade, I think it's someone who understands that we are all too often working within inefficient or broken systems, holds fast to morally grounded and data-driven solutions, and is not afraid to cause a little bit of good trouble to achieve them.
Trouble all day. Yes. Awesome. I'm going to ask you one last question. If there is one thing that you want our audience to act on, what would that be?
I would say come visit Central Appalachia and see it for yourself.
All right. So what are y'all thinking about climate resilience?
I thought that was fantastic. Just absolutely everything was fantastic, from how they're engaging with community, how they're framing investments, because that's tough to do. It's tough to talk about climate resiliency in coal country. It just is. And to frame it as a backyard issue is so brilliant. And this is, hey, if you want to live comfortably, this is what we need to do. And to do it in a way that doesn't alienate people, doesn't talk down to people, but engages with folks, and how can we work together to create a community that we're proud of, and backstopping with good financing. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah, I think I'm leaving with a surprise, kind of like adult kind of, why am I surprised that the work and the things and the projects are so integrated and interconnected to jobs, housing, like it's kind of like, duh. Of course it is, but I think it goes to the other thing I'm feeling, which is guilt for not caring more than I should, maybe from just the work that I'm involved in, or Oh, I'm not beating myself up. I mean, but I think it's an awareness now. We talked about this on one of our shows about, if you're aware of it and still sit by, are you participating in the system that's broken by not doing something, or are you taking action from where you sit to help break down systems or create solutions? And so I think it's that where I'm like, now I'm aware of stuff at a deeper level that I actually can influence and impact from many different places that I'm involved in. And so it's not guilt. I mean, guilt is a good thing in this case, because I may actually do some shit about it. No, I will do some shit about it.
And that's fair, but also like balance with the things that you've already accomplished and that already are doing. And don't guilt trip yourself into that, because as you said at the top of the show, you recycle, you compost, you have solar panels, you've made significant progress, and it's fantastic to go deeper and to go further, but don't beat yourself up. Like, this is every day and how to keep it moving forward.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think it's not punishing myself in my head. It's kind of the awareness and we all have those moments where you learn something new and you feel good about learning something new, but also like, I wish I knew that 5 years ago. It's probably more of that ladder of, now that I have this information, where can I be more intentional and add to the things that I'm already working on without kind of undoing or, dilute, like saying it's not been enough, from the other things.
All about that, not about the negative self-talk. As long as we're at positive self-talk. All right, fine.
I love exactly what they're doing. I especially, like their approach to community. Or when I heard about what they were doing before, it reminds me of a quote that I've heard about: "You don't make decisions about us without us." And they are being extremely intentional about making like community decisions as a community. And I think that's what's so unique about like their approach, right? Because there are so many people who are not a part of a community and they come in and think they know all the answers, right? And they aren't taking that approach. I don't think that Andrew or Baylen hit on this, but they have like an entire community advisory council that they're working with to provide feedback about what exactly are we doing. Like, yeah, let me tell you what the people on the ground really, really need. And I love that. It's not I hate this word because it's used so loosely, but it's not an elitist approach, right? This is a collective thing.
I think it's a secret sauce to successful community development finance is how are we listening to impacted communities, because they know the solutions much better than we ever will. And how do we bring all of that into our approach together?
Yep. They figured out something.
Yeah. There was something else that they touched on. And my old buddy and colleague at VCC, Sandy Ratliff, I don't know if she listens or not, but if she does, I miss you. And everything she's been doing out in Southwest Virginia since she was born, let alone as a professional. But getting to know that region and everything we're saying right now about community. And they started to say a version of, like I look at Richmond and we're good enough because we haven't had something as catastrophic as a whole industry dying within 10 years, or like leaving and taking all the jobs. And so like areas like the rural communities that I've been involved in, it's like they had no choice but to be innovative and strong and collaborative, and have been doing it for decades. And it's like, I think we underestimate that power and the fact that power is there already. And so they started to touch on that and everything you both said about their approach to community and kind of the sovereignty that's already baked in, and letting that grow and not coming in from the outside and saying, we know better than you do. We'll tell you how to fix it.
Well, they're leading by example. If there are some other folks who want to do something to support their region or their communities, consider this a starting place.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Renegade Capital. If you like what you heard, you can listen to previous episodes on your favorite podcast platform, and be sure to follow us on social media at Renegade Capital, or check out our website www.renegadecapitalpodcast.com to never miss a new release. Our show is hosted by Andrea Longton, Ebony Perkins, and Leah Freemount, publicized by Elizabeth Gilbert Ketzel of Narrator Studios, and produced by yours truly, Chance Lee.